About 14 months ago, I had a delightful conversation with a PhD student in England about her dissertation on the book of Job, of all things. As planned, Ellie Wiener is back to give us an update on one of the most profound books of the Bible. Welcome to Thinking Biblically. My name is Alan Gilman. Thinking Biblically is a podcast dedicated to exploring how all of Scripture speaks to all of life. Before I introduce my guest, I want to remind everyone, if you haven't done so already, to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, please comment and share. All that really helps in getting this podcast out to as many people as possible. Well, about 14 months ago, it was my privilege to have a conversation about the book of Job with PhD student Ellie Wiener. And Ellie is back. We had talked about the possibility of her coming back about halfway through her dissertation and then returning after it's all done. And anyway, so we managed to have this conversation today, and I wasn't disappointed, as we had yet again a delightful conversation about a difficult, very profound book of the Bible. We go down some interesting trails as we discuss, which I think you're going to find intriguing and important and helpful. And then I offered, towards the end of the conversation, I offer a little theory about why Job was included in the Bible in ancient times. It's a question we don't often think about, and it might simply be where my mind and heart are at this time, but you could decide for yourself. I am very happy to welcome back to Thinking Biblically Ellie Wiener. Ellie is a PhD student at the University of Cambridge in England, where she's working on a dissertation on the book of Job. She was my guest on Thinking Biblically in December 2022, when she was just getting started. We had a lively discussion about one of the heavier, more difficult books of the Bible, and I'll provide a link to that discussion in the description. I shared at that time that we hoped to check back in about halfway through to see how she's doing and where things are at with her research, and I'm glad that she agreed to do that. Ellie grew up in the Chicago area and later did undergraduate and graduate studies north of Boston. She graduated from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in May 2022 with an MA in Biblical Languages and an MA in Old Testament. She loves the outdoors and tea even before moving to England. And in her words, she loves to explore how the story and imagery of the Old Testament render the gospel intelligible and breathtakingly beautiful, which was something I locked onto at the beginning of our last time together. And I don't normally listen to old podcasts, but because we're doing this follow-up, I did. I'm glad I did. Did you check it out by any chance?
Oh, back in December I had, but
okay. Yeah. It was really something to re-listen to it again after about 14 months. It was quite something. We got into all these like big topics of biblical narrative and reductionism. Some of my favorite topics because of your interest in the story and imagery of the Old Testament, and it's so important. And I was so grateful for how you opened my eyes to a bigger picture than what we normally see when we read the book of Job. If we read the book of Job, because my theory is a lot of people stay away from it, which is not the only biblical book they stay away from. That's a different topic. But I really appreciate how you helped us to see it's a lot bigger than we normally think. With the normal way people look at the book of Job, as you know, is answering the question of why do good people suffer? But there's far more to it. So why don't we start by you again summarizing what your dissertation on Job is about, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much for another conversation, Alan. It's a real joy. Trying to think, actually in December, of 2022, I would have had a different title for my dissertation than I currently have. So in Cambridge, at the end of your first academic year, which is certainly not 12 months after you've begun, but after the first academic year, you have what's called a first year review. And in that process, you're essentially, you turn in a portfolio and then you're grilled by two academics who are not your supervisor. And that was a really fruitful process and sharpening, I think, in some of the ways that I was sort of framing myself in scope and methodology for the project. So essentially, now I think the easiest way to describe and how I most often describe my project is I'm essentially asking the question, does the Book of Job resolve? And if so, how? And so that's kind of my entry point into the scholarship, around the Book of Job in a very sort of macro literary theological sense. It's a very sort of hermeneutically rich project, as in I'm not doing sort of micro philological research, but a much broader project,
Well,
thinking about how the book works as a
one
whole.
thing I'm noticing already, you're about halfway through in your dissertation, and you're using way bigger words than the last time. And
Sorry, just
yeah,
pause.
a lot of people that watch this, they're interested in these topics, but they
Yeah.
may not speak scholars.
It's so,
Do you want to translate
jargon.
what you
It's
just
good.
said?
Thank you. All right, let's stick with the question, does the Book of Job resolve? And if so, how? So I think for most people, when they read the Book of Job, it is quite obvious that there are different literary sections. So you can read the first two chapters and register, okay, this is some pretty stylized, terse narrative. And then you hit chapter 3 and you feel, okay, we've just entered into poetic territory. And within chapters 3 to 41, you have even different voices speaking and sort of different literary demarcations within those chapters. And then you end the book in chapter 42 with another bit of narrative. Okay, so everyone can
Literary
identify.
demarcations, folks. Like I run into that in the grocery store every day.
Just
I'm gonna bring you back down to earth.
so good. Oh, I
Because
appreciate that. I welcome
after you
that.
do your dissertation, you got to do the popular version book written in
Right.
English.
That's right. Actually, that would be the dream, would be to publish my dissertation as a scholarly monograph, keep all the jargon, all the
Yeah.
Hebrew technical stuff in there, and then publish one that's much more accessible for the lay audience.
And do you
Um,
know why they're called monographs? Because I would love to know that. Because I've gotten
yes.
some. First of all, I look up some interesting topics, and sometimes only a scholarly, very academic book is available, and they
Yeah.
cost like a
It costs
gabillion
too much
dollars.
money.
But I've
Yeah.
discovered interlibrary loans. I don't know if that's true worldwide, but where I live, here in Ottawa, Canada's capital, we've got interlibrary loans, and I can get for free borrowed books from all over North America. It's wonderful. But why do they call these things monographs?
Yeah, monograph. So just coming from, if you just break the word down, anyone could grab this. Mono being one and graph meaning writing. So essentially, it's just uh, a topic that's highly detailed and sort of specialized, and one person's writing it. So
Like
it's written by one person
like
and it's
many
done on
books.
topic, like most books. So it has the added connotation, though, of being quite technical, quite specialized. So it'll take a topic and go quite narrow and deep rather than sort of broad and expansive. And
Right.
usually you can honestly just tell by the sticker price. If it feels like it costs way too much money, probably a monograph. And they
Oh,
often
okay.
come
Okay.
for
Right,
years.
right, right, right. So I can
So
raise the
just
price of my
publishing.
books and call them monographs. Um,
Sure.
so going back to how
Okay.
Job is put together,
So
we've got these
yes,
bookends. We've got these
yes,
bookends of stories,
yes.
right? And stories doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. That's a whole other topic. I don't know if we'll get into that. But a story could be a fictional story or non-fictional story, but it's told like a story. Like,
Yeah,
somebody got up in the morning and they didn't have any milk in the fridge, and so they went to the. So that's a story.
yeah,
Right. Okay. And then it moves into the bulk of the book is where most of us get lost. And it's
yeah,
all this poetical stuff. And of course, in English, we know it's poetry because it's all jaggy in the way that it's laid out on the page.
yeah.
Hebrew doesn't look like that, but somehow you Hebrew experts, you can tell a difference of when it is a story or a technical description or something, or it's poetry like the Psalms. But it's pretty
Yeah,
clear by the language and how things are being said. The bulk of the
yeah.
book is poetry.
That's right.
But
That's
this
right.
thing about does it resolve? Most of
Yeah.
us reading the book, and I talked last time how I was really impacted by how you at the time how you explained where you thought the book was going or book went or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah.
For most people read it that the book starts out with this major problem of Job losing everything and suffering so much. Then his friends, quote unquote, come by. They give him all sorts of very spiritual, non-helpful advice. Then finally, God speaks to him. It's very dramatic. And then Job responds at the end. And then the story wraps up and
Mhm.
Job lives happily ever after. And it doesn't
Mhm.
quite say the end, but you feel it that it's saying
Yeah.
the end, and that's
Yeah.
a resolve. And everything is is all the broken pieces of Job's life are restored, and we could heavy sigh, and we can go to bed. Now,
Right.
is it possible? Are you saying that it actually may not resolve?
So I'm entering a conversation within Jobin scholarship where I would say the prevailing perception is actually that Job does not resolve, at least in a way that we would normally think of as a meaningful resolution. So there, historically in Jobin scholarship, there was a set of reasons for that. I would say the more current conversation that's so colored by postmodernism is more that we sort of postmoderns prize ambiguity for its own sake. Such that there's just meant to be sort of this clash of competing voices in Job, and there's not meant to be any controlling perspective. And so the reader's just kind of left at the end of the book, uh, potentially fair game to judge God for what he said. You could agree with Job, you could not agree with Job. We don't even know what Job is actually saying at the end. And so it just kind of leaves the reader with this array of perspectives, and they can sort of make of it what they will. That, I would say, is one of the currently sort of dominant approaches to the book. So I'm
Can we
trying.
talk about that for a moment?
Sure.
Okay, so folks, we're going to talk about a little bit of the mechanics of literature, and it actually is important because the Bible is writing, and the better we understand some of those dynamics, the better we can get to whatever, if there's a point or not a point or something. We just see how it works. And so I remember seeing the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks,
Hmm.
and that's the one with that the guest star was a volleyball, and he ends up on this desert island for a long time, and at the end of the movie, he's after he's rescued, he comes back, and there's a potential love interest possibility that happens, and he literally gets to this country road crossroad in his truck, and he's standing there with a map, and he's trying to decide, does he go to north to Canada, somewhere south, back to this possible love interest house, and the movie ends. So you
Hmm.
can't get more obvious than this film is not resolved. And then
Yeah.
you turn to the person, I think you're supposed to turn to the person you went to the movie with, and you ask, what do you think he's going to do?
Yeah.
And there's no way, purposely the way it's written, there's no way to know. And it's
Hmm.
completely left to the audience. And I'm
Yeah.
sure some people would go, well, absolutely, he goes back to the woman's house, and no, he's not going to do, that's, but people
Yeah.
are going to be pretty adamant.
Yeah.
Now, before I get your reflection on Job, the way Job's written, isn't it written as if, and everything's resolved and Job lives happily ever after? No, you may not like the ending, and then now the reader is hopefully going to be engaged,
Yeah.
and that's one thing. But isn't it written in such a way to say at least the story
Yeah.
internally is resolved?
Yeah. I think absolutely. I think there's so many textual indicators that, yeah, the book is driving towards resolution and it is providing something. And that, as you say, then I think it does toss back to the reader. I think the reader is very much meant to be involved. I think the book is constructed in such a way as to invite and in a sense require the reader's participation as they sort of evaluate and wrestle their way through this text. So I think it throws back to the reader at the end of the book, okay, are you willing to trust the God of Job? The God who says he's not accountable to answer you on your terms? Will you trust him to govern what you cannot control and superintend it with wisdom? Do you trust him to know what you cannot understand? And yeah, I think the book is really, it's so unapologetic about God's responsibility for what happens in God's world. And yet I think it really is written within a context of fear of God. So I think it's sort of the implied reader, like the ideal reader of the book, I think is a God-fearer. Like it's trying to address you, God-fearer, who know that life is filled with inexplicable pain and unanswered questions. And how is it possible, worthwhile to go on fearing God in such a world? And I think it sort of brings you on this Jobin journey through 42 long chapters and does actually leave you with the re-entry of the divine voice, which I take to be uniquely authoritative. And I think within the literary world of the text, I think it makes most sense to read it that way as well, and within a canon of scripture. So if you take the divine voice as authoritative, when God speaks 2 times again at the book's end, I take that to be determinative for the way that I evaluate what has unfolded up to that point. Now, I will add a complication that still leaves us with some challenging questions about resolution, given that when God speaks in 2 directions at the end of the book, first he addresses Job from the whirlwind, and he rebukes Job. And then you get to the epilogue. So that was in chapters 38 to 41, he rebukes Job. You get to the epilogue, and in chapter 42, verses 7 and 8, God is rebuking the friends because evidently they have not spoken in a way that Job has. So Job's commended there and held up as the example. So I think that still does leave some interesting interpretive questions, which then I think should probably challenge the questions that we're asking and may challenge sort of the interpretive grid that we're using for what resolution means. But nonetheless, I would still say the book is certainly meaningfully resolving. And it just may be that some people don't quite like how the book resolves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Now, listening to the last time we talked, you were very focused on the relational aspects of the book, and you brought in something that you had learned from another professor about that, unlike what most English translations, how they treat the end, the issue had to do with, it wasn't that Job's friends didn't speak rightly about God, that actually they should have been speaking to God about Job. Is that still there in your one-day monograph?
That's right. Very much so. Yeah. I still take that to be a real interpretive key for the book. And I think it actually provides a way that you can very reasonably sort of square God rebuking and commending Job. Because the Godward orientation that Job has exhibited throughout the book is the fundamentally commendable thing. Whereas we're so welcome to speak to the Lord honestly when we're struggling. Like the scriptures give us ample grounds for doing that, ample encouragement for doing that. That doesn't mean, though, that everything that comes out of our mouths is actually sanctioned and is reflecting the truth of who the God is governing the cosmos. And so I think that's where, Job could be very soundly rebuked by the Lord. But honestly, to me, Alan, it just seems that, the closer we get to truth, the closer we get to paradox, almost always. And so it seems to me it's quite possible for Job to be simultaneously humbled and dignified by the fact that God answers him. And actually, shouldn't we expect paradox if you have a genuine relationship between a creator and a creature, right? Who are ontologically, who are in essence unlike each other, and yet there is real relationship, and there is I think that's conveyed by dialogue in the book, the fact that there's speaking and answering and listening and responding. So I would certainly place emphasis on the dialogue piece in the epilogue, and also say, let's think about that with regard to the entire book. So I'm very much using dialogue as sort of a narrative thread, if you will. Maybe that would be a helpful way to phrase it, as I'm looking at the way the book develops. And I've done a lot more thinking in the interval between our first conversation and now about why the book is the way it is in terms of being so long and so hard. So I think I certainly do put a lot of emphasis on those ending chapters in terms of understanding what the whole book is doing. But I've spent a bit more time thinking, okay, what do we do with those long, confusing middle chapters that everyone wants to skip? So that's another piece that I've given a bit more thought to.
As you're talking, I'm wondering, are you facing a challenge of how do you do a dissertation on Job and not a commentary?
Yeah.
Because all the levels, yeah. So how are you handling that?
Oh, that is a good thing that I have a supervisor, Alan, because I feel that as I approach the book of Job, in my effort to be able to communicate the riches of this biblical book for God's people, I need to be asking some of the very big picture questions about how the book works and why it matters, where it fits in the canon of the scriptures. And in fact, in already starting to teach the book, it's been very relevant to do that work. However, I am not writing a commentary. I'm also not writing a popular level book yet. And so the genre of dissertation has been, I think, one of the more challenging things to get used to, just with the appropriate kind of nuance and conventions that requires. So it means that I just have to ask the big picture questions and do that work, but then only reflect in my dissertation a much narrower slice of exegetical work. So I will have the majority of my detailed work in the text be on chapters 38 to 42 in my dissertation. At first, I was quite audaciously committed to covering the entire book of Job and making a grand tour through the whole thing. And my dear supervisor was patient with me and just kept saying, Ellie, I don't know, we might want to reconsider our scope. And sure enough, eventually it became clear I really did need to narrow pretty significantly. But it's a glorious book. Sometimes I think, it'd be so much easier to be doing Obadiah or something for a dissertation.
Well, that's interesting, though. My understanding of a PhD thesis is that the higher up you go in the scholarly world, the more minute is the focus of the concentration. I remember I came upon some I think it was a PhD thesis on the word gar in Greek, which is therefore, and that's what it was about. But we need somebody to do the research into that one itty bitty word, because it's an important word in the New Testament. So somebody goes off and does that little tiny thing, and that helps us in understanding the bigger picture, and from the big picture to the minutia, back and forth. Do you have a working title?
And if title. What is? Oh, yes, my working title. You always need a good colon in an academic work.
Yes,
so of course we have one of those. So it's A Conversation with God, the book of Job in dialogic perspective, the resolution of Job in dialogic perspective.
And we started off with you doubting if there is a resolution?
Yes, well, that's where I have to sort of situate myself. So one of the odd quandaries that I've encountered as someone who very much has a high view of the authority of scripture and is doing a PhD in an academic setting is that sort of the premise of a PhD is that you're meant to say something novel And I just think, oh, that's a bit funny. I don't tend to approach the scriptures looking for what I can say that no one else has said before. I typically approach them hoping to be faithful, more than novel. But I found that actually it very much,
Can I stop you there? Like
yeah,
that was a goodie right there.
yeah,
So I kind of get that,
mm,
because I spend a lot of time when I'm preparing a talk, or I'm writing. I do this weekly Torah bites and commentary on the books of Moses, or these podcasts. I don't want to just reiterate something that all these other people have said. You can get that information, and
yeah,
but then I wonder if there are people that are put off or just not interested in, when you're talking about Bible and novel, meaning something new, because shouldn't we simply be rehashing the tried and true?
mm,
But it's not so much saying something new about the Bible. It's
mm,
like an archaeological dig, which is an illustration that I love to go to. And we go to Israel, and there's these mounds called tells,
mm.
and it just looks like dirt. Maybe there's grass, maybe not, and you start to dig, and you can find civilizations under that under that hill, and I
Mm,
see the Bible that way, and there have been things that have historically risen to the surface, and we retell those, and that's great. But when you dig, you're finding what's underneath, and there's just so much there.
oh, inexhaustible riches. I
Right.
was
So
spending 2 years of my
novel
life.
doesn't mean kind of cool, neat, the latest thing that I've found. Everyone else, they don't know what they're talking about. It's just
Yeah,
you're digging. And so
yeah, yeah.
please
And
give us gems that we haven't seen
yes.
before.
And I'll dig for 3 years and come nowhere close to exhausting what there is to say about the book of Job, right? So, yeah, I think there's also something to be said as far as faithful biblical interpretation goes for timeliness. I think oftentimes we see in the biblical text, there's something about wisdom being timely, like there being an apt word for the right context and the right time. And so I think one of the ways that I'm trying to do something useful and worthwhile with my dissertation is to make a timely contribution to the conversation going on about Job. Uh, yeah, in scholarship now. And of course, I'm keenly aware that probably most of what I'm saying, like rabbis thousands of years ago, probably already said most of it on the book of Job. But I think there's something to be said for sort of engaging living interlocutors and sort of recent, even if they've passed away now, but recent interlocutors. And yeah, and actually thinking about how is the book of Job good news in the world in which we find ourselves? So it is sort of this, yeah, this digging for the latent treasure that's been there all along, and often digging to sort of, yeah, recover or become more in touch with sort of the really gritty rootedness of the text at the time that it was written in the context, to the people for whom it was initially addressed. So you do that work, and then there's also work to be done in articulating freshly the word of God for the people of God, in the current milieu in which we find ourselves, the kinds of questions people are wrestling with. So yeah, that's, I think, been helpful for me to sort of frame myself that way as I think about the task of the dissertation and the contribution. I want to have a really modest assessment of myself generally and just not assume it's a good thing when I open my mouth, or start typing. So yeah, I don't want to think too much of what I'm doing, but if I think, oh, I'll just say something helpful and that I am in good conscience believing is true, from the scriptures, then yeah, thanks be to God for that. Um,
Are you still sticking with the original thing about talking to God about Job as opposed to talking to Job about God from the
uh,
last time? Is that still there, or have you revisited that?
Yeah, no, that's very much there. In fact, I one of my first writing projects, so a portion of a chapter that I wrote, which is what I handed in with my first year review. I actually went to the end of my thesis and I wrote 10,000 words on Job 42, 7 and 8. So that was one of those places where I did drill in, drill in pretty thoroughly. And I I pray that I'm actually exercising that in my own lived experience. I often ask the Lord that it would be the case that I don't articulate anything to other people beyond where I'm actually at in relation to the Lord. I just, yeah, want to be very careful that I'm not sort of theologically opining beyond what's actually a lived reality. So I hope that I'm actually praying more fervently than I'm even writing about prayer. But I do still, yeah, make very much of that point in my, yeah, in my own approach to Job.
So
So
thinking back on our last conversation, that was really a a pow kind of moment when you explained that and the implications of the whole idea of we tend to spend more time talking about people than
yeah.
we do praying for them. I even talked about praying for government and that sort of thing. And if we can get into gossip, and it's almost like Job's friends were gossiping about him while he was sitting there suffering.
Yeah.
It has that feel,
Yeah.
and that feels like a resolution to me. It almost feels like a moral lesson,
Mm,
which I tend to I I I suspect the Bible isn't written that way. At least it should lead to conversation, it should lead to discussion, lead to pondering, not simply
mm,
here's the answer of the question.
yeah.
But thing is, if it leads to an answer of you're not, you need to be interceding for people more than talking about them, that's a good place to send people. But it
Mm.
still sounds like a resolution.
Yeah, yeah. No, like, yeah, let me be very clear. I do think the book of Job resolves. I'm more sort of cutting against the grain of people saying it doesn't resolve.
Oh, okay, okay, that's
Yeah, yeah.
helpful.
So I
Yeah.
do very much think that the book resolves. And then I'm thinking, okay, what is the manner of that resolution? Let's highlight its relational dimensions, because I think dominantly that is, yeah, that is the kind of resolution being offered. And in the midst of this, I want to be very careful not to offer sort of a neat, simplistic reduction of the book. So, yeah, let's maintain a Job that is just rich with depth and color, and that's meant for meditating, rereading, pondering, digging, to use your metaphor. Um, and yeah, and I also think it's very significant that even as the epilogue offers this sort of portrait of a return to wholeness and flourishing, where Job has his fortunes restored to him and everything is sort of escalated. So you don't, it's patterned on the prologue, that initial narrative bit, but it doesn't just recapitulate it, it's escalated. But that all happens after Job has said in chapter 42 verses 1 to 6, essentially, as I take it, as I see it, I'm satisfied and I'm ready to move on from my mourning. And at that point he's still sitting on the ash heap, right? And so I see actually the restoration of his fortunes in the epilogue as sort of this measure of superabundant grace. I think it's impossible to get to the end of the book of Job and think that God is sort of paying Job back for a wrong done to him. Like, yeah, it's very clear that God is not accountable to humans and doesn't owe them anything. And yet, I think it's the most natural thing in the world that Job would end up restored, because God is a God of superabundant generosity and is not angry with his servant Job. Um, so I think it is important that that resolution, that primary relational resolution, takes place in God's address of Job, Job's response to God, and then the way that God, yeah, sort of heals that interpersonal rift by implicating Job now as an intercessor for these conspicuously uninterceding friends. And so, yeah, Job then becomes the instrument by which the friends are sort of healed in relation to God. And it also forces Job to get on their side and kind of ally with them in a way that they didn't ally with him. So I think the book is actually, yeah, really brilliantly addressing all of the fraught and frayed relationships that had developed over the book. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you. How's the memorization plan going?
Alan, done. I've been done for a
Really?
long time. Yes. So here's what happened. I started on November 11th of 2022. And within 6 months, I had finished the book. So by early, what was that then? By early May? Yeah, I had finished.
Yeah, for folks that haven't seen the first one, you might be thinking that Ellie has memorized the Book of Job in English, but no, 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 in Hebrew.
I did. So this was, yeah, as I was
Can you
beginning
pull
my
a verse?
PhD.
If somebody asked you for a verse, can you do it? Or
Oh,
or do you have to? Would you have to start at verse one?
chapter 1, verse 1. So I haven't memorized all of the verse numbers. However, I can access every chapter at its beginning. And then depending on what you ask me to recite, I may be able to peg the verse number because I
Okay, but
memorize.
still, if I asked you to start at chapter 30, you could start reciting.
Yes, I could.
What style of pronunciation did you use?
I just use modern Hebrew
Okay.
pronunciation. It's funny when you learn biblical Greek in a seminary, they give you Erasmian pronunciation, which is sort of this reconstructed pronunciation. But most students of biblical Hebrew just learn it with modern Hebrew pronunciation. So that's what I followed. I tried to follow the accentuation of the Masoretic text as closely as possible. That's just kind of the
Right.
pronunciation tradition handed down from brilliant scribes in the Middle Ages.
Do you have a favorite verse in Hebrew that you could recite for us?
Oh,
I'm putting her on the spot. We didn't talk about this beforehand.
yeah. I'm trying to think of, I will say the first thing that comes to mind are some passages where Job just has the most brilliant, beautiful Hebrew, and the poor guy is in so much pain. So I felt a little bit badly as I was memorizing because
Well,
I would just be
good poetry
reveling
still
in the
comes
Hebrew.
comes out of pain, right?
Oh man, I would just be reveling in the Hebrew, and the poor guy, the text that I'm reciting is actually quite sad and intense. Let's see. So, uh, okay, so Shalev Haiti vai parpereni ve'achaz orpi by fatspitseni vai kimeni lo le matara. So that may not sound very exciting if you don't know Hebrew. If you do know any shred of Hebrew, what floored me about that verse was the reduplicated stems. So there's a really brilliant patterning in the way that consonants are sort of doubled in words, which I think gives it a pretty rhythmic flow to it. Another place that I think is really good.
What verse was that, or what? Just can you recite it in English?
Sorry, that wasn't very helpful. I didn't give you any context. So that is in chapter 16. And the verse would be translated something like, I was at ease, and he, like, tore at me. He, taraf, like he ripped at my neck and tore me apart. He set me up as his target. So it's like really, it's Job expressing, his distress at God being, as he perceives it, this divine attacker. And as you go on in that paragraph, it continues to be very vexed speech, but brilliant Hebrew. And I know as I'm doing this, I feel like an absolute Hebrew novice. And I know I'm only catching a very small slice of the text brilliance. But it was so good to
And
read.
you passed the test, so that's great.
What do you mean?
Well, I asked you for a verse. You gave it
Oh,
to
that I
me
was
in
able to
Hebrew.
produce. It's true. I do have some friends who say, yeah, we've never actually heard you say the whole book from beginning to end. So I don't
But
know. It is, I have this now sort of regimen of going through 7 chapters in my head every day. So
wow.
once I finished the book, I just thought, okay, I'm going to maintain this by Monday to Saturday, just doing 7 chapters in my head, such that once per week I could get the entire text through me again.
Oh, so
Um,
it takes you a week. That makes sense. Yeah,
yeah,
very
42
good.
chapters, 6
Seven
days.
chapters a day. What, 6 days a week?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
Sunday off.
Yeah.
And
Nice. Um,
yeah.
have you delved into, or whether it's, I'm sure you've run into it in your studies, but the dating of the book and the latest best guess as to when this book emerged?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and actually is one that I get, I would say, most frequently from sort of the average layperson. So if people hear that I'm doing, yeah, Project in Job, very likely someone will say, "Oh, isn't that the oldest book of the Bible?"
Hmm.
I'm like, "Oh, interesting. Where'd you get that from?" And usually people don't know where they're getting that from, but a lot of people have heard that. And I will say, Alan, oh my goodness. I mean, you can pick your commentary and you'll get such a range of perspectives on the dating of the book. People will argue from the Hebrew itself, the kind of Hebrew in the text, sometimes to say it's an early text, sometimes to say it's a late text. People will try to pick up on maybe shreds of what seem to be historical details in the text, like, oh, the Chaldeans were raiding. Okay, what time were the Chaldeans raiding? That sort of thing. So there's a whole range of ways that people try to approach the date of the book. I would say, okay, so for myself at this point, I feel fairly comfortably agnostic, actually, because I just think it's really hard to pin down. If pressed, I would
Oh,
say
hold on,
actually,
folks. Just Ellie didn't say that she's an agnostic, okay? That she's
no,
using the
not in an
term
ultimate
again.
sense.
She's doing this. She's been in the academy, and sometimes people. She's talking about she's kind of refusing to make a decision on this question. She's reserving her opinion, maybe for another time, maybe not. It's something like that.
Yes, thank you for
Oh, you're
good
very
clarification.
welcome. Well, you never know. Your enemies might grab on to this podcast and put
Very
on
true.
TikTok or Instagram or one of those really wild social media
To quote them.
platforms. Yeah, Ellie Wiener's an agnostic. Yeah, don't buy her book.
Thank you.
No.
I do appreciate that
Yeah.
clarification. Yeah, I would say if pressed, I would say actually that I would be more likely to put the book as a fairly late text, actually, within the collection of Old Testament scriptures, largely because the book has so many connections, what scholars will call intertextuality. It just means connections between the book of Job and other parts of the Bible. And because it's so richly connected to Torah, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, to the Psalter, many different literary connections. It seems to me that that would just make a bit more sense if the book of Job is coming after a lot of those texts and is referencing them. Um, I will say, I think it's very important for the reader of the book of Job, more important, we'll put it this way, more important than knowing when it was written is picking up on when it's kind of staging itself. So Job looks like he's a contemporary of Abraham. He kind of looks like he belongs to the era of the patriarchs. And I think that those, yeah, there are ample literary clues to that effect. And so I'm most concerned to sort of enter into the world of the text. And yeah, I think it's quite interesting, perhaps telling that you don't have any temporal markers in the book of Job. So you have geographical markers. You know that Job is from Uz. You know the three places that his friends are from, but you don't actually have any temporal markers in the book,
Except
unlike what you
except
would
for you
get in
said the Chaldean attack.
potentially,
But then I get
though.
could that be centuries?
I mean, yeah, the Chaldeans were
Yeah.
on the scene for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Um, so again,
yeah.
yeah, a bit
Have
different.
you have you delved into I don't know if it's theories. I don't know if people can know for sure how came to be part of the Bible. Why was it chosen? And because there's many writings, and that's what made into what we call the canon of Scripture is a whole topic unto itself. Most
Yeah,
people who pick up a Bible or now on their Bible on their phone, uh, the Bible, but it actually
yeah,
books were chosen, other books were rejected.
yeah.
Are there theories on Job? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, to be honest, this is not an area where I've done much reading. I will say I've not yet encountered any sense that Job was ever a very disputed book. So it was actually, yeah, quite readily, quite in a quite early fashion, accepted as an authoritative part of the scriptures. So yeah, it does belong to the Ketuvim in the Hebrew Bible, the writings.
Like the
Um,
Psalms.
right,
Yeah.
with the Psalms. So usually, well, often Psalms, Proverbs, and Job will be kind of the first three in the Ketuvim. Um, yeah, and just know that it's been quite unproblematically included there. Though I don't, yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much detail to give you
Want to
with
hear my
regard to
theory?
canonization.
I have
What's
a
your theory?
theory, and I just came up with it the other day. I don't mean I think this is actually quite serious. I will
Okay.
admit that because of where my head and heart has been for the past half a year,
Mm,
it's given me a particular filter through which to look at the scriptures. But
mm,
even if I'm wrong, I don't think my general filter is skewed. In fact, I think
mm,
the filter I'm using is a biblical one. Maybe
mm.
you've never thought of this before. I would have a hard time to believe. I started looking some stuff up very briefly. I didn't
Yeah.
find anything. I'd be really surprised if no one has ever thought of this before. And
Mm.
maybe we're going to find out it's very, very common. And before I give my little theory, just one more precursor here, like my big word, precursor, that even a theory or a conclusion about why something was chosen to be in the Bible doesn't necessarily say anything about the actual meaning of the book. So we can
Mm.
get into I think it's controversial Song of Songs. Like, what's it doing in
Mm.
the Bible? Why? And
Sure.
the reason for it. How does that relate to what the book is actually saying? I don't want to
Mm.
go down there, but I think that's a good example. Here it is. Why Alan Gilman possibly thinks the ancient Jewish community included the book of Job. Are you ready?
I'm so primed. Very curious.
Job is Israel.
Ah,
And the friends, the first three friends, the main, whatever you have a technical term for them, how they function, like the kind of friends, if these are your friends, you don't need enemies, but the friends are the nations.
mm,
Then Elihu comes and he's functioning more as a true prophet of God, and he
mm,
connects the whole situation. Basically, he's connecting all the other speeches to God himself that then leads to then God's view
mm,
and the confrontation of the um, of the of the misguided friends.
mm,
By my saying that Job represents Israel, I am not saying that Israel therefore is perfectly righteous in every way, the way Job is depicted in the book.
mm,
But what Job is showing is that the one who is in right place with God, right relationship with God, is enduring all this suffering. The world looks at that suffering and goes, aha, you're getting what you deserve, buddy, which is what the
mm,
friends are saying with all this highfalutin theological language. When
mm,
Job is not deserving of that, that's not why he's suffering. He's suffering because God has picked him out for this task of suffering and becomes a target of God, not out of punishment, but for God's own purposes. And that's a story of Israel. Now, of course, Israel, like all people, we, the Jewish people, have sinned, but much of our suffering, look at the story of the Passover, which we're right in Passover week now, we ended up in slavery because God sent us to Egypt to be saved, not because we weren't in slavery because of our sin.
mm,
We're disciplined and judged later for sin. But in the start of us of a people, we're suffering simply because we're chosen, no other reason. And
mm,
that, whether I'm right that that might be why they included Job or not, I think there is a legitimate parallel there.
mm. It's really interesting. I will say, there are certainly people who have articulated that the book of Job ought to be placed after exile because it's an effort to sort of reflect on the exile, where Job is Israel and yeah, and this sort of the nation trying to come to terms, or the remnant that's returned after the exile, trying to come to terms with the scale of that suffering.
But
Um,
the exile was a consequence
I know. I
of
think,
sin, as
yeah.
opposed to something like Egypt, which was not.
Yeah, yeah. So I honestly have not found the exile reading particularly compelling because I think you have the prophetic voice within the scriptures, which is very clearly interpreting the cause of the suffering, whereas the whole premise of Job is that this is happening hinam, which is a Hebrew word for no reason or without cause. Um, yeah, oh, that's
But
really
the
interesting.
godly people get picked on. And Yeshua tells us that if we're going to follow him, we're going to endure persecution. And that doesn't
Yeah.
stop people from wondering, okay, so I'm maybe I'm suffering for my faith, but I really don't deserve this,
Mm,
just like Job. And so Job is depicted as a moral, perfect character, but it's more about he didn't deserve the punishment that he was the suffering he was going through. He was a target created by this cosmic conversation between God and the devil. There was
mm,
no relationship between his lifestyle and what
yeah.
he was suffering. The world looks at him and goes, "Oh, he must be suffering because there's something wrong with this guy."
Mm,
And again, not to say that the Jewish people are in any way morally perfect, but witnessing the dynamics of anti-Semitism.
mm,
And in fact, I believe the whole church should be more of a target than it tends to be, that there's something wrong,
mm.
that when the church gets along with the world
Too well.
in the way that it does, when actually the church should also reflect the suffering of the people of Israel, suffering because of our connection with God and no other reason.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's a good word. And some of our, yeah, brothers and sisters in the church around the world are obviously very keenly aware of that. Oftentimes, yeah, Western Christians are a lot less, yeah, a lot less conscious of, yeah, of what could feel like pressure or persecution, even because of connection to God. It's really interesting connecting the friends to the nation. The friends, in some ways, articulate what could sound to be sort of sound Torah reasoning, but I think misappropriated and misapplied to Job. And in fact, the fact that Job has boils from the sole of his foot to the top of his head, that is actually a covenant curse from Deuteronomy. So he's not being punished for sin, but he does look actually like he's a cursed one. Um, and so I think
That
that's
plays. That's the whole European Jewish story, and the way the church determined that we were in this state because of rejection of our Messiah, actually, killing
oh
God sort of idea, to the
yeah.
point that it was insisting that we reflected a boiled state to show the world what happens to you when you kill God sort of idea. And
Mm,
talk about Jobian.
mm, hmm.
So you don't think I'm too crazy?
Oh man, I mean,
God will be my judge, but I'm just asking you.
that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, I always feel better about biblical interpretation when things can be situated within broader theological frameworks. And yeah, I think you're certainly right to identify this sort of consistent, yeah, thread through the scriptures of there being resistance and opposition to the people of God. I'm actually working on right now a sermon on the stoning of Stephen in Acts 6 and 7. And yeah, you very much have the sense that there are two kinds of ways of being human in the world. There are those who resist the activity of God and those who receive it. Um, yeah, yeah, that's just really thought-provoking for me to sort of conceive of Job, not in just individual terms, but in much more sort of broad communal terms. Yeah, I'm gonna keep, I think, mulling on that one.
Yeah, maybe.
I
So
will say,
get.
Alan,
Go ahead.
oh, I do depart from you on Elihu, at least so far.
Oh, just
I,
my quick little theory on a walk I was taking recently. Like
yeah,
who? Yeah. Anyway, maybe we could talk about that another time,
yeah, yeah,
about his function, because he is quite interesting.
yeah. We can circle back.
Yeah.
So.
What did you say?
Oh, I said we could circle back later. We
Oh,
don't need
okay.
to.
Okay.
We
I
don't
thought
need
you
to
said
do
he's the
that.
best, but I
Oh,
didn't hear that right. um, uh, but if you run into any information on this particular thing, have there been other scholars, commentators who have seen this parallel? If you could just send
mm,
that to me, that
yeah,
would be
yeah.
great. And then on Stephen, by the way, do you think did he have to come on so strong? But you can get back to me. I was reflecting on that too, because I don't see the Bible, even the Bible heroes. They're not necessarily perfect. There's only the Messiah is a perfect human,
Mhm.
and I wonder because he ever blast he blasts them big time, and then he was a Hellenist and he's talking to the Judeans, and I think there's a lot of stuff going on there. I don't want to mess
Yeah.
up your sermon, but oh boy, Bible's fun. Isn't Bible fun?
Oh, endless riches.
Yeah. And I mean fun in the biblical sense of the word.
What's
Whatever
that? Oh,
whatever
yeah,
that
yeah,
means. Whatever
absolutely.
that means. Anyway, this has been great and I really appreciate you, even dealing with some of my theories and when we first talked 14 months ago or so, we talked about maybe coming back when it's all done. And
Mhm.
I don't expect you to commit to that now, but are you still good with that plan?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
And so, do you have a date, a
Ooh,
completion date yet?
I have just recently started to think much more concretely about timeline, and based on where I may end up after my PhD, I think it's started to compact things a bit more. So as soon as maybe February of 25, I might be trying to submit. And then hopefully having my oral defense, they call it a viva, before summer of next year. So
Okay,
actually, that would be definitely less than 3 years. So we'll see if that's actually feasible. But
right.
I
But it's
think
still
that,
that kind of time frame.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
All right.
we can circle back. That'd
Yeah.
be great.
Well, looking forward to hearing how it goes, and again, any of that information
Yeah,
that's come up, if you could send it my way, that would be great. If people want to
absolutely.
contact you, how shall they do that?
Yes, absolutely. Feel free to contact me if you wish. My email address, I think, should be below in the comments. So it's just emw78@cam.ac.uk. So a good
Right.
old university email. Be
Yeah. And
happy
we
to.
will, and I will put that in the description like last time. Any final words before we go?
Oh, just thanks so much for a good conversation. Yeah, what a joy.
Yeah. Joy on Job. Boy, oh boy. Who would
Job
have
and joy
thunk?
is one of my favorite phrases. So
Oh,
I use it regularly.
joy on Job?
Job and joy.
Job. Oh, Job and joy.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, we'll see if it catches on in the t-shirt, your merch, after you release your popular version of your book and all this Job merch. Oh yeah.
It'd just
Yeah, I
be
was at a
Job
so
rags,
for the
that's
fest
all.
for the I don't know if I mentioned this last time. Many years ago, I went to a Purim party, and Purim Festival of Esther, and it's costumes is part of the thing. And there was somebody who came as Job, had all these little like crusty things all over his body. Yeah, all right, but yeah, well,
Oh,
yeah, Job and Joy, can't wait. Okay. Ellie, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
oh, absolutely. Thanks to you, Alan. I really enjoyed it.
So, again, if you want to contact Ellie, you could do so by email at emw78 at cam.ac.uk. That's emw78 at cam.ac.uk. That will also be in the description. Same with contacting me. You could do so at comments at thinkingbiblically.org. Also, don't forget to put any comments in the comment section, as well as like, and if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to this channel. And so until next time, this is Alan Gilman with Thinking Biblically.